Hi everyone, I am Ariane, Pensée la Presse event officer. The society aims at inviting experts on diversity of topics so that everyone can learn and talk about them. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Sarah Barmak. But first, let me introduce you Anna, who will be co-chairing this first English webinar with me.
Hello everyone, I'm Anna and I will accumulating your questions and ask them at the end.
So now let's move on to Sarah Barmak, our guest speaker. You're an author and freelance journalist who writes about sexuality through the lenses of science, culture, and social justice. You adapted your first book, Closer, Notes from the Orgasmic Frontier of Female Sexuality, into a very interesting TED Talk, The Uncomplicated Truth About Women's Sexuality. We recommend both the TED Talk and the French version of your book, namely Jouir, En quête de l'orgasme féminin. It is a great pleasure to welcome you tonight, or should we say this afternoon, as you're in live from Toronto. But before we start, let me ask you how you are experiencing the current situation and potential thoughts you may have regarding the links it may have with women's pleasure and sexuality.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Well, for me personally, and by the way, it's super great to be here. I'm so excited to speak to French readers. So thank you for having me, Stacey and Ariane. But in terms of COVID, my husband Jeff and I, we've been pretty lucky, I would say. We can do a lot of our work virtually, and we have a small child, which means that we're indoors a lot of the time anyway. So we're not worried about school and whether to take our kid to school or not. So that part is lucky, but it's a challenge like everyone else has been experiencing for sure. We're about to go into a cold, dark winter in Canada, and we just in Toronto we just got lockdown. The second lockdown began on Monday. Not quite as intense as the one in March, but still pretty serious. So I think there's sort of like a dark mood settling over Toronto and Canada. So yeah. In terms of sexuality and pleasure, it's really interesting. At the beginning of COVID, and this just shows kind of people's conceptions around sexuality. At the beginning of COVID, there was a lot of talk about, after, 9 months from now, after this lockdown in March, there's going to be a baby boom. There's going to be all these babies born because, everyone's locked inside. What are they going to do? Everyone's going to have sex. Everyone's going to get down. And I think that's so interesting because now we've just been reading some of the first academic studies on sexuality during COVID are beginning to come out now out of the Kinsey Institute in the US and other researchers as well. And they're showing what a lot of people have been seeing themselves, which is that actually people are having less sex than before COVID began. So it's like the opposite of what people predicted. They're having, so couples who live together are having less sex. And people are talking about a lower satisfaction with sexuality. And it's clear. I mean, when people are stressed, when they're anxious, when they don't know what tomorrow will bring, when they're worried about having their children indoors with them, then people, they don't have the relaxation and the inner, calm to have sex. They don't feel like having sex. They don't feel like connecting. They don't have time. They don't have space. They have kids around them. They don't have privacy. So I think this has been super interesting to watch it play out.
Well, this is very interesting to talk about privacy, because a first question that we might want to ask is sexuality a political matter? So something that also concerns the public space and thus public policies and public education. So is sexuality a political matter, even in times of lockdown where privacy takes so much room?
Yeah, absolutely. And everything is political, but sexuality, I'd say, is political in specific ways. So, just what you were saying, it's about freedom, and it's about agency over your own body. It's about kind of the ability to experience your body as a site of pleasure, as the ability to kind of live a full life, in a sense. And it becomes political when one group of people over years, over history, is given a privileged access to pleasure and to privacy, to agency over their own bodies, to even medical or anatomical knowledge about their own bodies from a young age. And other groups of people, whether they're women, LGBTQ folks, non-binary people, are given less agency around that, then it's actually politicized. It's not that women are suddenly, making it political by talking about the fact that it's political. It's been politicized by those structures of power. So absolutely it is. Mm-hmm.
So we'll surely talk about LGBTQI plus sexuality, but first let's maybe focus on straight women, so to say, and the shame that surrounds women's sexuality, maybe more than men's sexuality. Could you maybe talk a bit more about those?
Absolutely, yeah. Always excited to talk about shame. I think it's a good question, because it's not natural, actually, to experience shame around sexuality. It's something that seems like we're just born with it, but it goes back in many ways to Christianity, to kind of even early Christian writings around the body and around kind of privileging the spirit or the soul over the body, but especially over women's bodies. In the course of researching my book, I kind of found these early writings where early Christians were horrified that Christ even had to be born from a woman's body, and they tried to find ways that maybe he was born in a different way. I found that to be pretty amazing. But and that's kind of been handed down over the decades, to shame when it comes to talking about menstruation, about periods, about the idea that women's bodies are inherently dirty, to just how women experience this growing up, being told, like, you shouldn't touch yourself, that it's dirty, that it's wrong, that it's something that nice girls don't do, experiencing shame around menstruation, as I said. So, when you get something passed down culturally as well as just individually in your own childhood, then it becomes pervasive. But it doesn't have to be that way.
I think we wanted to talk about education, and as you mentioned, there are strong incentives for women not to touch their bodies, not to discover, not to know how their body is basically built. And while working on this webinar, we just recalled that while at school we had those sexual education classes, in which we tackled sexuality in really, let's say, risky, and the risks that sexuality might bring. So talking about contraceptives and so on. But especially, so a focus on the risks that it might bring, and not the pleasure, the desire, consent. So in your opinion, what should be the role of education, and in particular of sexual education, and how this might contribute to a more inclusive society and a society that would offer sexuality to both straight women, straight men, and people that would be either LGBTQI+, or that would not recognize themselves in either the women or men categories?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you raised sex ed. There's actually been a movement in sexual education to more and more associate sex ed with social change and you know, and political change and social justice, which is super interesting. And I think this goes to just what you were saying, to basically the privileging of information over some types of bodies and not others. So when I went to school, you know, in Canada, even though it's a very, you know, it was a very liberal community to grow up in, I learned about, you know, I learned about the penis, I learned about penetration, I learned about reproduction, but all of the drawings of women's, you know, what was called the reproductive system rather than the sexual system, which is actually, it's an important difference. All of those drawings, of all of them, none of them showed the clitoris, none of them showed the labia, the vulva. It was all about just the vaginal canal and the uterus and the parts of the female body that were important for reproduction, the ovaries. So there was no representation of the clitoris. There was, of course, representation of the penis in sexual education, and, you know, how it functions and, you know, erections. So, and this is, again, something that can become naturalized. It can become normalized as like, well, obviously you need a penis to have sex. Well, what kind of sex are we talking about? Are we talking about penetrative sex? Are we talking about oral sex? Are we talking about using fingers or tongues? Are we, you know, talking about the fact that women don't need penises to have an orgasm? They don't need penises to feel pleasure. And, you know, when I say women, I also mean anyone who has a vulva or vagina or a clitoris, or anyone at all for that matter. So privileging that type of anatomy, plus also, as you said, privileging the idea of the risks of sexuality. You know, it's enough to make, you know, if you're sitting there and you're someone who identifies as female, you might think to yourself, well, okay, what do I have a lot of stuff to avoid. I have a lot of stuff to be worried about, and there doesn't seem to be a lot in this for me. And I think that this might be kind of not, this might not be obvious to some people, particularly cisgender men. They might think, well, you know, yeah, but you feel pleasure anyway, no matter what the education system tells you. But I think there can be a lot of differences due to culture, when men always get those messages growing up of that, oh, boys are only interested in one thing, and they learn about their penises and erections in school, then they're going to also internalize this information as sex is natural, sex is pleasure, it's part of my birthright.
And talking so about the differences that that are visible between the group male and the group female. In your TED talk, you mentioned that the orgasm gap. So I'm not sure we have statistics on LGBTQI plus individuals, but at least we do for straight women and men. And so you say that straight women tend to reach climax 60% of the time they have sex, whereas for men it is rather 90% of the time. So could you give us more detail on this orgasm gap and what it tells about culture in our societies?
Yeah, and I'll correct my TED Talk, so I made a slip of the tongue in my TED Talk, but it's 60% of heterosexual women in heterosexual relationships have orgasms most of the time, whereas 90% of men have reached orgasm most of the time in those sexual encounters. But the gap that you're speaking of is there regardless. And I hesitate to, reduce all of pleasure to the orgasm, which itself is problematic, because pleasure is many different things. It isn't just reaching orgasm or reaching simultaneous orgasm, but it does matter for sure. It matters when we don't learn about female anatomy, and it matters when girls and people with clitorises don't feel that they can express sexual agency in relationships, don't feel that they can talk about what turns them on or how they like to be touched, or maybe haven't been given the space or the time to explore what kind of touch feels good by themselves, with themselves. You really do have to, I think it's best when young people are able to experience their sexuality in their bodies on their own, by themselves, with no pressure about pleasing somebody else. To have that time in your teenage years to really explore your changing body and to explore fantasy, explore all of the images that are out there. What images turn me on? What images turn me off? Before or as you're starting to explore your sexuality with other people. I think women and girls and non-binary folks as well can feel a lot of pressure to have their sexuality defined by the needs of their partners, especially when those partners are men or cisgender men. So what's going to make this person happy? What does this person want me to do? And kind of judging the outcome by whether that person has been made happy. So yeah, it does mean a lot.
And talking about that, so you just mentioned a consequence of the lacking understanding of women's bodies by women themselves. Could you maybe give other examples of the consequences of these misunderstandings or misconceptions that we might have around female bodies, or the ignorance about the female body, be it individual ignorance, but also medical ignorance from the scientific community?
Yeah, there are many different consequences that we can talk about. I mean, there are everything from, the dumb idea that, during COVID, everyone's going to have more sex and have babies, because we don't understand that higher stress leads to less sexual arousal, especially for women. To the fact that when we have all these taboos around sex, that young people don't explore it, that they don't, especially young women, don't develop those neural habits, those neural pathways in their bodies around pleasure, that kind of experience of knowing, this is how I like to be touched, this is how my body likes to be touched, this type of pressure, this type of speed, actually getting really to know yourself. And I believe it also can encourage a normalization of bad behavior on the part of some portions of society, basically. So when there's a structure where sex is considered more of a boys thing, where women's sexuality is tabooed, then you kind of get a situation where bad behavior can sometimes be dismissed as boy talk or locker room talk, because we've created a taboo around women's pleasure. So, and then there are extreme cases, of course, where women in different societies don't talk about it at all. For example, the series Unorthodox, which dealt with a woman growing up in a Hasidic community, who, you know, women in her community didn't talk about sex at all. So you kind of see the definition of sexuality to men in terms of meaning penetration, penis and vagina sex, and procreation. So there are multiple different consequences that can happen.
It's really interesting to see that you're talking about the structure of sexuality being both things. So I don't know how it is in Canada, but at least in France, we have had a series of articles in the past few days dealing with incest, but also, again, the Me Too movement and how what it brought to French society, or also worldwide, obviously, and also to violences within couples, within pairs during the lockdown, because maybe sexuality has not increased in terms of consented sexuality during the lockdown, but there has been an increase in violences, and so not consented sex, and this is definitely an issue that governments have to deal with right now. So really interesting to see that what you're talking about. We also read that in the news currently, and talking so about the Me Too movement and maybe violences or consent. This movement has had. We will be pleased to have your opinion on that. A huge impact on the awareness about rape and sexual violence. Would you say that there's a link between the general taboo around sex and maybe female sexuality and the level of sexual violence in our patriarchal societies?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that. It's a super important topic. There is a link, I believe, between sexual violence and rape culture and the culture of taboo around sexual satisfaction for women and taboo around women's sexuality. I believe that when agency is considered to belong more to one section of the population, to cisgender men, then men become normalized as aggressors, as initiators, and we develop these sexual scripts. So a sexual script is something that it's like a playbook that we all inherit. You know, they have them very explicitly. If you talk about BDSM, you can have a script that you're going to follow, but then we have these more nebulous scripts that we don't even really talk about as being scripts. They're just sort of normalized, that we all follow, that the idea that men are in charge of the sexual encounter, men should initiate, cisgender men should, their pleasure is the end point or the goal of the sexual encounter. And not that this necessitates sexual violence, but I believe there can be a connection there. When you normalize some level of aggression, some level of sort of men being a little bit pushy, of kind of not taking no for an answer, then you get this really difficult situation where women have to play the passive role. Women and anyone identifying as female and non-binary folk are pushed into that passive role, necessarily pushed into a role where maybe their desires or their sense of, you know, maybe I wanted this half an hour ago, but maybe I don't want it right now. Maybe I wanted to do this act, but I don't want to do this act. That's not part of the sexual script, and that can be, you know, that can itself lead to sexual violence if men experience that as shameful, experience hearing that no is shameful, then that can often lead to sexual violence. So we often tell women and girls just say no, but in fact saying no in many cases has led to to sexual violence. So it's extremely complicated, and that's, so talking about that script, I think, is one of the big steps that we need to take.
In terms of talking about scripts, we had the first question on public education and the role of schools, but I'm also thinking about Instagram or social media more broadly, where we have lots of different pages and on which you can find sexual information about sex, consent, pleasure, desire, and so on. And those are extremely progressive, even though you might have others that are less, that might spread fake news. But what would you say that those can complement schools, universities, colleges, and so on? Or would you say that they try to complete something that is just not well done by public educations, by states?
Yeah, I think it's a great thing in general, the fact that there's access to information, there's access to these different channels, to social media. I mean, more information is a good thing. Of course, there's good quality information and there's bad quality information. It's definitely better than the situation back in, maybe a decade or 2 decades before, where it was just pornography was the only other source of sex ed. And in fact, today, pornography is actually still one of the main sources of alternative sex ed for people beyond school sex ed. Just in terms of mechanically understanding, okay, what happens during sex, preteens watching porn as a way of figuring out how sex works, which is a little freaky sometimes to imagine. But so when it comes to sex educators taking to Instagram or taking it to YouTube, I'm super all for it. I think it's a great idea. There are a lot of people out there with great channels. There was someone I saw the other day, Vanessa Marin or Moran, and I think she's American, and she just had a video about how to masturbate. If you have a clitoris and a vulva, how to masturbate. And you might think, oh, doesn't everyone know how to masturbate? Well, actually, breaking it down, strokes and speed and getting in the right zone and just kind of the mechanics. I think it's amazing to have all of these options for information out there, not least because getting on those channels is much more accessible for marginalized communities who haven't been represented in the world of sex education or in movies when it comes to sex scenes and don't see themselves represented. So you can create a YouTube channel, you can create a Twitter feed talking about sex, no matter what community you come from. So that's definitely a good thing.
And in terms of an easier access to information, what could be those consequences for both men and marginalized people? Because we've been talking about women, but this could also be interesting to know to what extent better knowledge about female bodies, but also other types of pleasures that may be considered alternatives when in fact they are not. So how a better information about those could have positive impact for societies and not only for individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that when we stop seeing, I think we need to stop seeing sexual variety as you said, as alternatives, as kind of minorities, and we need to kind of see the proliferation of ways of loving as just part of our inheritance as human beings. I mean, I think that people are a lot weirder than we give ourselves credit for. Even just speaking to housewives, speaking to college students, I've always found that people have kinks, people have fantasies, people have all of these things that they don't really talk about, but it's there. You know, we talk about there being sexual subcultures and these minority groups, but I think it's much more common than we realize. And you know, maybe when we talk about just going back to women having more sexual problems or complaints, one of the biggest, probably the biggest complaint among people who identify as female is lack of desire. And if we kind of flatten desire and kind of whitewash it and kind of push kink and all of those fantasies to the corner, maybe that kind of explains that experience of low desire in some ways.
And in terms of fantasies, I'm sure they are linked to scripts, because what we can imagine, then we try to reproduce, right? So I've also listened. You mentioned in the TED Talk different scripts that men and women have. And you say that men tend to have linear scripts, whereas women are more circular. So could you maybe elaborate on that?
That men are more, say it again, that men are more...
Have linear scripts that follows specific steps and have one single goal, so to say, whereas women might have the opportunity to move around and then go back, and there are backs and forths, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of one of the tragedies of defining sexuality in general according to kind of a cisgender male model, is that sexuality in general has been thought of as more linear, as this thing that, you know, begins with a fantasy or begins with desire. It kind of builds with arousal and touching, and then you kind of, there's a little plateau, and then there's an orgasm, and then the denouement. And this was the model kind of established by Masters and Johnson back in the 1960s, and it's very neat and tidy. The only problem is when they started to apply that to women who would come into psychological sessions saying that they had low desire or difficulty reaching orgasm, then women's experience would be applied to that model and found to be dysfunctional. So, okay, so you don't experience desire at the beginning. Okay, dysfunctional. Maybe you have desire that turns up in the middle of an encounter. You have desire that turns up toward the end of an encounter, which is called responsive desire, and is found to be completely normal among women and men, actually. And yeah, of course, and then women tend to experience, but it's not just women, it's really all people can experience sex in this non-linear way. So having multiple orgasms, having no orgasm, just having kind of rising and falling pleasure, you know, not really having a plan can work a lot better for women, for LGBTQ folks, for LGBT women, for all kinds of people, especially because it takes the pressure of having a goal off of sex. If you go into sex thinking that, okay, we're going to start at point A, we're going to both end up at point B, and if we don't, then we didn't do it right. Then you're introducing pressure right at the get-go, which isn't sexy. It isn't arousing.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the responsive desire, because so I'm currently reading The Wander Down Under, a user's guide to the Virginia by Nina Broshman and Ellen Strockendal. I'm not sure how one should pronounce the names, but I did my best. Anyway, and so they mentioned those two types of desires that men and women tend to have, because of course we cannot generalize, right? But women tend to have responsive desires. So they tend to respond to incentives that or around them, right? Whereas more men tend to have spontaneous desires, meaning that this could explain how they might how they might start the relation, right? But this calls into question the constant question again, because if we tend to consider women as being responsive, then again women are in that passive position, right? So could you maybe, I'm not sure, but about neuroscience and how the functions of the brains, right? And how differences between women's and men's brains, how those can influence how we experience desire and sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you raised this. So I interviewed the psychologist who is responsible for introducing the idea of responsive desire. She's actually Canadian. Her name is Rosemary Basson. And she explained it to me very well. And actually, there's a little bit of a danger of us kind of talking about responsive desire. So it's really, it's not necessarily in response to your partner's desire or something that someone else is doing to you, but it's in response to getting into a sexual experience. So it's the idea that you can begin a sexual experience not out of desire, but out of just curiosity, or you could just make a decision to begin without feeling desire. And a lot of women do this. They imagine that, okay, I don't feel desire, but last time I experienced pleasure, it felt good. So you know what, I'm gonna do it again. It's, you can start for many different reasons. It doesn't have to be that, oh, I have like burning desire right now. So responsive just means that, you know what, I'm going to get into it, get into the experience of sex, and then in the middle, desire arises. Basically, it's the desire to continue having sex. And so when you talk about men's experience of spontaneous desire, which is more typically men, what she actually explained to me is that the two aren't that different. So it's just responsive takes longer. That's all it is. Spontaneous is like, it's happening so quickly, but if you really broke it down, men are also kind of responding to something, or they're responding to a brush on their shoulder. They're responding to an image in their mind that comes in, or they see something, or they see something in a magazine, or they feel heat from a person standing next to them. Everyone is in a way responding to something. So, so we don't want to, there is a temptation to fall into the trap of saying, okay, women are responsive and passive, but it's actually more just a difference of time. And she explained to me that actually many men in long-term relationships experience more responsive desire. So yeah, super interesting.
It's really interesting because it made me think actually about the paper I read, but I'm not sure about like who wrote it. But basically the idea was that also in medicine, the egg was always in the discourse like written as something passive, whereas the sperm was always active and like pushing and like in this race. So I feel like it's also not only an idea that everybody has and a misconception, but also it like really gets into this discourse of in those little things that go back to sex education. And that's when people read about like the biological part, it's also like included in that.
Absolutely. And even scientists, even doctors fall prey to these ideas of passivity and activity. Scientists, when they're writing science, fall into this. Journalists, when they are reporting on science, fall into this. They want to tell a story about, the egg waits passively for the sperm, and educators fall into this trap because this is just we rely on stories. I mean, all of us are storytellers, and we try to tell stories that make sense, that fit into previous structures that we may have heard. So it's not that, you know, everyone is like conspiring to rob women of their sexuality or their agency, although some people might be on purpose, but the rest of us are kind of just falling into structures that previously exist and propping them up, often without even realizing it.
And just to go back to what Anna just said, so in that same book, The Wonder Down Under, it's actually written that women have each month about 1,000 eggs that go out and then go in the fallopian tube, and only one will then go down the whole way, right? But it's not only one that is being ejected, but in fact 1,000. And so it reduces the gap that we might have between the number of spermatozoids, like the men's eggs that we have in sperm. Sorry, I missed the word. So it reduces the gap between the two types of eggs that men and women have. And thus it reduces the fact that women would be passive, or that this would be more exceptional for women. And yeah, this is definitely interesting. I think we also wanted to talk about religion and the role of religion linked to sex or sexuality. And we might want to start with news, let's say, that took place in Poland not long ago. In fact, there's been protests about the abortion laws that have been voted and then was rejected because of the protests that they have, that the Polish population organized. And so it raises the question of the extent to which religion influences people's sexuality, people discourses, the control over female bodies, and thus female sexuality. So do you have any thoughts about the role of religion and the role that religion might play in the framing of public policies, public discourses in the area of sexuality?
Absolutely. And I think what's happening in Poland has been amazing to watch. It's been incredible to see women and allies take to the streets and demand a stop to these repressive policies, which would definitely result in women's death, in lowered healthcare for women, in back alley abortions, and it's pretty scary. It's pretty scary stuff. And I think it's amazing to see people put themselves on the line and in danger in the streets of being hurt by police. And it shows how important these issues are. But religion does unfortunately play a huge role. I mean, particularly organized religion. And you see this in the States as well, of course, in the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court in the US. Her faith being a huge element of this, and her position as being anti-abortion, which she's extremely explicit about, absolutely plays a huge role in repression. And you know, we think that it shouldn't in this day and age, but it absolutely does. What the Pope says is reported, you know, by every single news media organization in the world. So yeah, absolutely, it does play a huge role. And we can go back and talk about, you know, the existence of taboo in religion and how that goes back thousands of years. But you know, what's important is the role that it's still playing now in affecting people's lives, affecting women's lives, the lives of gay and lesbian and trans people right now.
And we've seen still, like in the last decades, maybe not in Poland, but at least in France, I know that religion plays a lesser role than before. And do you think that's had like a good influence on the situation, if it liberated something, or if still there is this storytelling that is really in the minds of people, and that it's something that gets propagated even though religion itself is weaker?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Certainly, you know, France. We look to France. We look to the French Revolution, to to écraser l'enfant and all this, to as being kind of these important steps in loosening the hold of the church over public life. But a lot of what happened in the sexual revolution, if you could talk about it having a point in time in the 60s and 70s, although there might have been, say, release of sexuality from the institution of marriage, and with contraception, kind of a separation of sex from procreation. In many cases, society reproduced a lot of those repressive structures, even within so-called liberated society. So, within relationships between women and men, as we've talked about, men were still considered to kind of be initiating the relationship. Men's pleasure was still considered the most important thing in the relationship. And there were all of these contortions that culture went through in terms of how to talk about women's pleasure. All of a sudden, the free woman was this figure of mystique, but also condemnation at the same time, which we see in popular movies in the 60s and 70s, where women who have sex were starting to be depicted more and more, but also they died at the end of the movie, So I think it's these structures can be passed down in a way that isn't as apparent.
This evolution of the role of religion made me think also about the possible generation gap that could be felt today. Like, I feel now the youth is trying to educate itself, as we're doing now actually, and via social media and alternative education. And that maybe, when I'm talking with my parents, for instance, the dialogue is tricky. We don't have the same ideas about sexuality. And since public education is not really talking about it, we really need those alternative education platforms. But I feel like without getting the older generation on board, it's really hard to change things. How would you have maybe any ideas of how to get this older generation maybe on board and talk about it as well?
Well, honestly, my opinions on this are really just to hire young people, are really just to promote and hire young people. People who are Black and people of color, Black women, to hire people in positions of authority, and people who are educators, academics, people who have influence in media organizations. I think that's honestly where the way things are gonna change. As we see in politics, the election of people of color, the election of women, is something that has been held back, I think, for the reason of not wanting things to change. Certainly people in the older generation can be educated, for sure. But I think it's not going to happen in every case. And and I think that we don't have time to wait, in a sense. Like, the world is changing, and we have a lot of people are are suffering in specific ways. And I think it's, yes, we can educate older people, but really just promote younger people.
Wow, this sounds sort of pessimistic. But I mean, you're free to think what you wish. And I would love to ask you about, so you just said, and it's a sentence that I really like, I think, we don't have time to wait in innocence because people might suffer. And we are not talking about sexuality. We're not only talking about pleasure, but we might also be talking about violence. And so we tackled Me Too and rape. But I would like to ask you about how thinking about race can also help us think more comprehensively about sex, and how hierarchies might also be reflected into sexualities.
Absolutely. And I would, I've been thinking through these issues, and this is a huge, huge topic because often our conception of rape and sexual violence is contained within a structure that is sort of the experience of white and middle class people. Rape is something that was a tool in colonialization. It's something that is kind of, it's much different when you consider it within those structures. So, in Canada, for example, people who are Indigenous Canadians are more likely to experience sexual violence. Sexual violence is something that is deeply, deeply intertwined with issues of power. So there's a lot to talk about there, and it's a huge topic.
And I think this would be harder for France to organize or to do statistics on how marginalized people may experience, might tend to experience sexual violence more often than others, because the Constitution does not recognize minorities, and thus we're only considered French citizens, and the only distinction that is being made is between men and women. It's been introduced not long ago. So we cannot measure differences and gaps in terms of pleasure, but also in sexual violence amongst citizens, as we only have one category. So this doesn't help framing public policies to tackle those issues. And in terms of public policies, are you aware of any policies that have been put in place either in Canada or other countries in order to try and reduce sexual violences, or how research can help us link policies and what is happening on the ground?
Yeah, there have been many attempts, and there has been research into ways to reduce sexual violence, both on the side of sentencing and criminalization, and then on the side of education. So some encouraging things have been done in bystander education. So it's generally very difficult to face a group of people, say college students, and say, okay, the men among you, we're going to teach you not to rape people. It generally doesn't result in a lot of receptivity. But bystander education, people have been very receptive to. So the idea that teaching cisgender men, teaching men in general, that you can stop sexual violence in progress. You can be the good guy. You can be the person to see something happening that isn't right and put a stop to it. That has been much more successful, and they've done studies on it in college situations. Another thing that's been successful, that has seen some success, is first-year programs aimed at largely at women, female identifying people, in terms of actually, in terms of different things, how to experience sexual conversations, how to get comfortable saying no, how to role play different dating situations that you might get into, and even kind of exploring what is it about sex that they might want, exploring what they might want to say yes to, rather than just what they would want to say no to. So this is first year students who may not have given that thought beyond what might my partner want me to do, what will turn my partner on. So courses like that have actually seen some measured success in terms of reducing sexual victimization, which does bring up some difficult questions because it does put the onus again for reducing sexual violence onto women and onto potential victims. So, you know, it isn't a perfect solution by any stretch, but definitely research continues into this issue.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that men, but I mean, people that identify as men, but also women or non-binary people can be and can learn to be bystanders, because this is something you said. We normalized men as aggressors because of the rape culture, right? Just to put it into context, it doesn't mean that all men are aggressors, not at all.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And but this is really interesting to see that we can learn how to be bystanders and to have that solution, because of course, I mean, this is something that was also mentioned in French news, the fact that we could not date anymore because of that, you know, the fact that you have that sword above your head. I mean, I'm going to be accused of rape or so on. So interesting to see that, no, there's a way to not be disrespectful, and there's a way to react to disrespectful behaviors. And this is just efforts that we have to make in order to reach that point of knowing and distinguishing between what is and what isn't respectful. And I wanted to talk about art too, because you mentioned movies in which women were more and more depicted to having sex, but then died in the end. And the sentence, "we cannot date anymore," was pronounced by a French actress. So let's talk about art and how art might also play a role in normalizing women's sexuality, but also talking about consent. What would you say art could bring to this reflection and to sex ed in general?
Yeah, I'm interested which French actress said that. Did she say it was this sort of the context was post Me Too, that that women shouldn't date anymore, or that nobody can date anymore? Or
so it was Catherine Deneuve, which is quite famous.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look that up because it's probably famous in France, but maybe didn't get to me here in North America. So I think that film and television has a huge impact. It's one of the first ways that people play out narratives of what sex is going to look like for them, and most people can think of, you know, the first time that they saw sex in a movie as being an important event that they remember. And I co-host a podcast actually about masculinity and sexuality on film called Goodfellas, and we talked about so many different films, and talking about depictions of sex in them, even thinking about the film Blade Runner from the 1980s, and this intense scene, very coercive scene between Harrison Ford and you know, and the lead actress was very coercive and very aggressive, but at the time it wasn't really made a big deal of. So absolutely, watching these scenes from a very, very young age has a huge, huge effect. And writing films that, I mean, I think, are you familiar with The Queen's Gambit, the television series, with the woman who plays chess and wins chess all over the world?
I personally am not, but sorry,
no,
Anna might be.
Me neither.
Well, it's kind of a huge series here, and people remarked about the fact that the young woman in the series doesn't experience any rape at all, as being remarkable, because she's orphaned at the beginning, and then her star rises and she becomes famous, and she's playing chess in a man's world, and there are all of these opportunities where you would have assumed that, well, the typical thing to do is that she gets sexually assaulted and then she has to recover from that, but she doesn't. And what kind of messages that we're sending when ambitious women, when women with agency do experience sexual assault every single time, or that's always the plot in film or television, and what it means to have a situation where that isn't a situation that happens, or in the British show Fleabag as well. It's an amazing show that has a very different narrative around women's sexuality and agency. So yeah, that it definitely has a huge effect.
Well, thank you so much for all those thoughts, and we're going to move on to the second part of this webinar, namely the questions asked by the audience. As a reminder, feel free to comment on the Facebook Live, as we will take the questions and ask them to Sarah Barmak on live. So feel free to just ask any question you might have.
Can I, before we go into that, can I just make my book recommendation, because I don't want to forget before we sign off?
Go for it, of course.
So for anyone who is comfortable reading in English, I always recommend this book called Come As You Are. It's called Come As You Are, named after, I think, a Nirvana lyric, by Emily Nagoski. She's a PhD and she's a sex educator, and it's amazing. It's an amazing book that is super informative around women's pleasure, sexuality, female anatomy. It's like shame and how to kind of bust shame, and it's a really powerful book. So I really recommend it.
Well, thank you. We'll keep it for the end of the webinar. We'll just do a reminder about this recommendation, but thank you.
Perfect. Maybe there's even a French translation out there, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Well, we'll look into that in the next 20 minutes, but we'll now move on to the second part, questions asked by the audience, and I give the floor to Anna.
So thank you, Ariane. And thanks, Sarah, for the very, very interesting discussion. So a first question would be, if I understood correctly, that amongst feminists right now, there is this paradox between some feminists saying they're comfortable, or they actually like feeling like dominated in their sexuality, whereas it feels like a paradox when they want, they're advocate for women liberation, and maybe you have some thoughts about it.
I do have lots of thoughts about that. So it's a very common misconception to kind of confuse fantasy about power relationships with existing power relationships in our lives and in society. So you can have a fantasy about being dominated, about being a submissive in the context of a sexual relationship that is something that you choose and consent to, something that you know that you can stop with a word if you want, like something that you are a situation where you are fantasizing about not being in charge, about giving up control, about surrendering, that's something that turns you on. But you're still in control in the sense that you have a safe word, you have a safe sentence, you can stop that encounter because you have trust with your partner or your multiple partners or whatever the relationship may be. There's a difference between that and a larger experience of choiceless passivity that is placed upon women and LGBTQ people in society, where there isn't a safe word to end patriarchy. You're born into a situation where you're not in power, and people might judge women for having fantasies about being submissive. That's up to them. There are a lot of situations where you can find women who have actually worked through trauma in a really interesting way, sexual trauma that they've experienced, working through it by having a consensual BDSM relationship where they get to, in some ways, play out relationships where they give up control, but they play out that situation in a context where they actually have 100% control, and kind of healing those healing parts of that trauma. There are a lot of layers to that. So, and there's a lot to say about that.
Thank you. So a second question is about an app that has been developed in the United States to make a sort of contract between two people that want to have sex and to actually say they consent to it. And there's been a sort of debate about the fact that it's not really natural to have sex like this with this first contract before. Could you elaborate on that? Is it a good idea?
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate. It's something that seems on its surface like it might be a good idea, that this will clarify any gray area around consent because you're going to have a contract. It kind of seems like it would function like a non-disclosure agreement. You're going to start working for a company and there's a non-disclosure agreement, and then if you want to be a whistleblower later on, like, oh, you can't be because you've signed this agreement. A consent app would probably work a similar way, and I haven't looked deeply into that specific app, but I have heard about them. The issue, of course, being that if you sign a contract saying that you consent to a specific sexual act with a person, what if you decide in the middle of that act that actually you change your mind, you no longer want to consent, you tell the person, actually, I want to stop, and they keep going saying, well, you signed a form saying that you consent. Something like that probably isn't going to be admissible in a court of law. Although it's pretty hard to get rape convictions as it is. But I'd say that that's probably not the best idea.
In terms of people signing contracts before having sex, so this is not what we have in most cases, but when talking about prostitution, this is a form of contract because this is being paid, sex is being paid. So that's a sort of exchange. And is the willingness of wanting prostitutes outside the city centers a symptom of the idea that sex should not be associated with life in society, that it should remain private, that it should remain hidden, as is the case for other people that or issues, because prostitution is considered an issue for a lot of people. So as is the case for a lot of issues such as homeless people or prisons and so on.
It's certainly an example of the marginalization of sexuality, but I think it's also really goes hand in hand with the marginalization of the working class, of people in lower classes, of basically of people of color, of trans people, of the people who are more likely to work in the field of prostitution. And I've been really interested in just the growing argument around simply accepting sex work as just a type of work, as just decriminalizing and legalizing sex work is something that is definitely needs to happen. It's something that's not going away. We've always had sex work, and there will always be sex work. So it's just a choice that we're making as a society as to how to treat the people who provide sex work and work in that world, whether we consider them human beings and allow them to live a normal life and protect themselves, and or whether we force them to live in a situation where they're at risk of assault, of not being able to report their experiences to police, not being able to work with health, access to health services. So that's the real consequences that marginalizing sex work can have.
So another question, I'll read it. Someone has been really listening well about the sexual script. So the sexual script is sometimes so strong because of movies, etc., that sometimes it is hard to make the difference between what are constructed desires and what are genuine desires. And how can we make the difference?
Well, the trouble is there isn't really a difference. We construct our desires together. It's just a matter of whether you accept the constructions that are already out there, or whether you play a more active role in writing those scripts, which is something that you can do if you want. If you know that script exists, then you might say to yourself, well, I can write a better script. I can write a script that turns me on better, that turns me on more. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with watching a Hollywood movie and going, you know what, that really turns me on. I want to be like, I want Superman to like take me away, or I want to be Wonder Woman. That's what turns you on. Go get it. But if it doesn't, and you don't want to be, for example, female and passive, then you can certainly write other scripts. But I think the more that we talk about it, the easier that gets. I think the difficulty lies, and the gray area lies in the place where people they'd rather it be kind of mysterious. Some people would rather not really talk about it. They'd rather sex just be something that is kind of mysterious, that, oh, they're not really sure like why they're being turned on by something. They just want it to, they don't want to really talk about it. It's like almost like talking about it would kill their desire in some way. And a lot of people do feel that way. A lot of people do say that, and that can be due to internalized shame, or there can be other reasons. So, but it's super interesting.
So maybe last question. So one would be, are men that are male prostitutes invisibilized? Is that English? I'm not sure, but like, can we we talk about them less? And that makes me also think about maybe the fact that LGBTQ plus people are over sexualized in the storytelling, and yeah, how, like, why are those differences so visible in the storytelling?
Absolutely. Part of maintaining the fiction of masculinity that we have in our society, as in terms of being active, being a powerful role, is that we don't really include roles that interrupt that narrative, right? So male prostitutes would be one of them, or sex workers is probably a better way of saying it. And overly eroticizing LGBTQ folks in films and in movies. I mean, there are kind of three ways that LGBTQ folks have been approached in the media. I mean, first of all, by being completely invisible and not talked about. Second, by being demonized and thought to be terrible or bad people. And then, of course, by being objectified and eroticized, which you are seeing today in many ways, kind of being pigeonholed into certain roles, being put in the role of being the queer eye for the straight guy, of like kind of helping straight people in their lives because of how fabulous they are. And all of these are kind of forms of minimizing, I would say, of kind of ways of treating people as not in the full humanity that they are. So, and I don't want to send the impression that this is really all about liberating women only and LGBTQ folks only. I mean, all of this is about liberating men, cisgender men, from being in roles that are limiting. We talk about the man box. The man box is kind of what is considered acts that men do that can be properly considered things that men do, whether it's doing sports or being the leaders of organizations. We need to expand what is considered proper to what men do, and men can be passive in a sexual relationship. They can be submissive. They can lose control. They can explore responsive desire. They can have multiple orgasms. I mean, men, like the world is kind of is endless for the redefinition of men, not just the redefinition of women. And I could talk forever about that, but we're probably running out of time.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Thank you so much for all your thoughts. I'm not sure, you might want to repeat the recommendation or add some more details on it, or if that's not the case, then I will conclude.
Yeah, well, just Come As You Are is the name of the book, and Emily Nagoski is the author, Nagoski. And it may or may not have a French translation, but I can look that up.
Thank you. So I just looked this up and I did not find any French translation.
Okay.
There's a TED Talk, which might also be helpful for people not wanting to read a whole book, but listen to 15 minutes of video, basically. Well, this is going to be the end of this webinar, but thank you so much for everything, every single answer you gave us. It's been a great pleasure to have you for our first English webinar on such a fascinating topic and such a brilliant issue, you know, or topic that, yeah, has to be talked about. As you said, we have to talk about sex, not to consider it as a mysterious aspect of people's lives. Understand that talking about desire, sexuality, consent will not make sex disappear, and that it will liberate men from being in roles that are limiting. It will also liberate women, and that we also have to stop considering so-called alternative sexualities as alternatives. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. And well, let's hope there's going to be a future.
Thank you so much for having me and for having the webinar in English. I really appreciate it, and much love to all my readers in French. And I've gotten amazing letters from some readers who are from France, and so I hope that once this pandemic is over, that we can travel back to France. I love traveling there. So thank you so much, and I much appreciated.